Okay, so we're studying Parshas Vayechi, and I'd like to look specifically at the brachos for Ephraim and Menashe. So that puts us in Perek Memches, chapter 48, which, if you're using the Art Scroll Chumash, is page 268. If you're using the Steinsaltz Chumash, it is page 263. And I want to begin with sort of a more homiletical question as opposed to a Tanakh question or a textual question. Some of you may have seen that I posted it on Facebook, and that is, why do Ephraim and Menashe become the names that we invoke when we bless our sons? When we bless our daughters, Yisimech Elokim, we say that Hashem should make them like Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, the Imahos. So why don't we say Yisimcha Elokim ke Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov? Why don't we invoke the names of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov? Why do we invoke the names specifically of Ephraim and Menashe? And of course, I'm sure there are many answers to that question, but I think we can understand one approach if we study this story and see some of the lessons that emerge from this story. So I thought that would be a nice way to introduce the topic. So let's begin reading first before we start with some more questions. It was after these things, after these matters. Vayomer li Yosef, someone says to Yosef, Hine avicha choleh, your father is sick. So the one thing that's interesting to note, it's just a very simple observation, is that this story of the brachos of Ephraim and Menashe is instigated, is brought about because Yaakov is sick, and because Yaakov is clearly at the end of his life. That's clearly the context of the entire Parsha. So I think it's important to note that the brachos of Ephraim and Menashe are a product or are introduced in the context of Yaakov is about to die. Vayaged li Yaakov, vayomer hinei vincha Yosef ba'elecha, vayischazek Yisrael vayeshev al hamita. And so Yaakov is told that Yosef is here, and Yaakov clearly is weak, has to strengthen himself to sit on the end of the bed. Yaakov el Yosef el Shaddai nirei. Now, what happens now is Yaakov goes into a small speech going over history, talking about Rachel to Yosef, and there's a lot to unpack there. There's a lot to discuss, which I don't want to get into right now. It's not the topic of my talk this morning, but it's interesting to note that when Yosef is told that his father is sick, he takes his children, right? Yosef could have been told, your father's sick, and go visit him, see what's going on, and then bring his children at a later date. But it's clear that what Yosef is doing here is bringing Ephraim and Menashe. That is the primary focus, it seems to me. And before we get to Ephraim and Menashe, Yaakov discusses a certain amount of history, and he makes a very important declaration. I'm skipping to Pasuk Hey, to verse 5, 263 in the Steinsaltz, 270 in the Art Scroll. Ve'ata, and now, Shnei vanecha hanoladim lecha be'eretz Mitzrayim ad bo'ei lecha Mitzrayim liheim. So now, Yaakov makes a very powerful declaration, seeing Ephraim and Menashe there with Yosef, that the two sons born to you in Mitzrayim are mine. Ephraim u'Menashe, ki Ruvain v'Shimon yihiu li. Ephraim and Menashe are like Ruvain and Shimon. And one thing I noticed, which is really fascinating, I don't know if I have a lot to say about it, but even before Yaakov switches his arms and puts his right hand on Ephraim and his left hand on Menashe, switching the order, Yaakov has already switched their order. Yaakov has already called them Ephraim and Menashe, not Menashe and Ephraim, which to me is a point of pride. I'm third of 4 children. I'm not the Bechor, as my mother can attest. So to see Ephraim be promoted is, to me, that's my team. Anyways, but it's fascinating that what Yaakov does in switching his arms, he already lays the groundwork for that by referring to Reuven and Shimon and Ephraim and Menashe. That Reuven, his Bechor, followed by Shimon, Ephraim and Menashe are like them, and he puts Ephraim first. Very, very interesting. Let's continue. Pasuk Vav, verse 6. Umoladcha asher holata achareihem lecha yehiyu, al shem acheihem yikru benachal asam. This I'm not going to translate it exactly, but they're going to earn a portion in the nachala, in the heritage, together with their uncles. Then he gets into Rachel, and then it says, very strange, something I'm not going to deal with, but Pasuk Ches, verse 8, Vayar Yisrael es bnei Yosef vayomer mi eleh. And Yisrael, right, Yaakov sees the children of Yosef and says, who are these? Which is a little bit strange, because he already referred to Ephraim and Menashe. So the commentaries deal with that. And again, I'm sorry, I'm not getting into it, but it gives you a sense of, at least it gives you a sense, I think, of the gravity of this moment, that this isn't just Yosef visiting his father with his sons. Something very important is going on here right now, something transitional, something formative. This is a milestone. If we talk about certain events being critical in the development of the bris, of how the covenant Hashem makes with Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, how it develops, whether it's banishing Yishmael, whether it's Akedas Yitzchak, whether it's the bracha given to Yaakov over to Esav, all those events are critical events. This one is one of these events. Vayomer Yosef el Aviv, Banai heim asher nasan le'elokim bazeh, vayomar kachem na elai v'avarachem. And Yosef says, these are my children, and Yaakov says, bring them to me, I want to bless them. Now, watch what it says next, because I want you to know, in preparing this class, this was the last thing I noticed, and to me it sticks out so much. I'm sure I'm not the first one to notice it. It's a very obvious observation, but what does it say next? Ve'ene Yisrael kavdu mizoken lo yuchal liros. Yisrael's eyes were heavy from old age. He couldn't see well. He could and he brings them close, and he kisses them, and he embraces them. Now here, literarily speaking, this is a prelude perhaps to Yaakov switching his arms. That Yosef thinks that because he knows that his father can't see well, and that's why he switches his arms incorrectly. He doesn't realize which one's Ephraim, which one's Menashe. But I think there's another thing we can learn from the fact that the Torah reports that Yaakov cannot see well. Because let's think about it. Here you have someone who can't see well, and he wants to bless a son or sons. What does that remind you of? Very good. That's exactly what happened with Yitzchak and Yaakov and Esav. So I think the Torah, with this detail and presenting us this detail, wants us to think about this story in the context or in relation to a previous blessing, the blessing of Yaakov and the potential blessing of Esav. And perhaps there's some sort of, I don't want to say, similarity or commonality. I think the point is, like I was saying before, is that this is as much a monumental event as that event was. And it has some of the same meaning to it. It's going to play out in a different way for Ephraim and Menashe than Yaakov and Esav. But it's something that the Torah clearly wants us to pay attention to. Can't see well, wants to bless. That's Yitzchak, and now that's Yaakov. And again, Yaakov kind of goes off a little bit on a tangent before he gets into the brachos. Vayomer Yisrael the Yosef, right? He wants to bless Ephraim and Menashe, but first he speaks to Yosef again. Vayomer Yisrael Yosef, Ra'o fanecha lo filalti. I never thought I'd see your face again. V'nei hira osi elokim gam ezarecha. Now I see you, and now I see your children. This is one of the original sources for nachas, right? This is an expression of nachas. Right? Yaakov is expressing nachas. And Yosef brings them out from amongst his knees, which indicates that they are small children who are hanging out around the knees of Yosef, and he brings them forward and they bow. Veikach Yosef es shneim es Ephraim bimino mismol Yisrael ves Menashe bismolo mimin Yisrael vayagesh alav. And Yosef presents them, Ephraim to Yaakov's left hand, and Menashe to Yaakov's right hand. And the fact that it says Vayikach, Yosef took them, positioned them, carefully, and then Vayagesh alav and presented them, brought them forward, clearly indicates that this is. I'm not saying anything novel here, but just it's very intentional what's going on here. Their positions and how they receive the brachos are very important, as we know. And the pasuk makes that very clear. Vayishlach Yisrael es yamino vayashes al rosh Ephraim v'hu atzoir. Right. So Yaakov puts his right hand on Ephraim, who is the younger, v'smolo al rosh Menashe, and his left hand on Menashe. Sikel es yadav. He switched his hands. Sikel could be understood in a few different ways. There's a lot of discussion in the commentaries how to understand the word sikel. Ki Menashe ha-bechor, because Menashe was the bechor. And then vayivarach es Yosef vayomar, and then again, you have this back and forth where he's giving blessings to Ephraim and Menashe, but he speaks to Yosef. He puts his hands on Ephraim and Menashe, and then he speaks to Yosef. Again, there's what to discuss there as well. Vayivarach es Yosef vayomar halokim asher yisalachu avosai lefanav avram yitzchak halokim haro osim yodi. Ad hayom hazeh hamalach hago alosi, the wonderful, beautiful pasuk. V'korei yivareches hanaarim v'yikari v'hem shemi v'shem los Avram v'Yitzchak v'yidgo larov b'kerev haaretz. And so he delivers this bracha, which is understood by many to be the bracha for Ephraim and Menashe that was conveyed through Yosef, but with the hands on Ephraim and Menashe. What Yaakov essentially says is the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Yitzchak walked, the God who shepherds me from my beginnings until this day. May the angel who delivers me from all evil bless these young men, and let my name and the name of my fathers Abraham and Yitzchak be called upon them. May they proliferate like fish in the midst of the earth. V'yidgul arov b'kerev haaretz. And so Yosef, hearing this beautiful blessing, notices that something is amiss. Vayar Yosef ki yashis aviv yad yamino al rosh Ephraim vayira beinav. Yosef sees and he thinks it's wrong. Vayismoch yad aviv lasiro sam al rosh Ephraim al rosh Menashe. Like any good son, he just takes matters into his own hand and tries to push his arm. Vayomer Yosef el aviv lo chein avi. Kizeh bechor simi michal rosho. You've got the wrong one. You should put your right hand on the bechor. Vayimain aviv. And of course, the father refuses, because parents and children never see eye to eye. I know my son, I know. He will be a nation, he will grow. But his younger brother will become greater than him. And his descendants shall be the plenitude of the nations. And he goes on, and he blesses him on that day. Vayasem es Ephraim lifnei Menashe. Okay, very good. So I think one of the most fundamental questions to ask, among many others, in what just transpired here between Yaakov and his grandchildren is, Yaakov seems to be showing some preference or favoritism towards Ephraim, which is quite startling given Yaakov's experience with favoring one child over another. The fact that he gave special attention, special kesones to Yosef brought about a terrible series of events. It fostered a sense of jealousy and enmity amongst the brothers. Yosef made his own contributions to that situation, the way he conveyed the dreams to the brothers. But it's the same concept, right? That Yosef's dreams that he shared with his brothers were about his greatness over them, right? All of them bowing down to him. And now here Yaakov expresses out loud that Ephraim will be greater over his brother Menashe. And so we're trying to understand what does Yaakov think is going on here? Is Yaakov repeating a mistake? Is Yaakov repeating this favoritism? It seems like Yosef recognizes it. It seems like Yosef thinks, yeah, Yaakov's making a mistake. And I, from my own personal story, I know what can go wrong by favoring one child over the other. And so Yosef tries to address the matter and tries to rectify the matter. On the other hand, you could say that Ephraim and Menashe are too young to even notice. Right? Ephraim and Menashe are, I don't know their exact ages at this time, but they're young enough that they're it says that Yosef had to take them Me'in Berkav from his knees, right? They're small enough that they're hanging out around his knees, that they can hide behind his knees. And so clearly Ephraim and Menashe perhaps could be too young to really even notice what's going on here. And so the first thing I'd like to suggest, first of all, is that, of course, Yaakov knows what he's doing here. Of course, Yaakov has a certain intentionality, and it's a divinely inspired intentionality. I think there's another element of Yaakov's own personal story, of Yaakov's own experience, which we can draw on. Right? We don't have to focus necessarily on what went wrong with favoring one child over the other. Instead, let's focus on something else. And that is the fact that Yaakov knows what it means to be chosen. That Yaakov is very familiar with the notion that individuals have their own destiny. You see it in very stark fashion between Yaakov versus Esav. Right? Yaakov is chosen over Esav, or Yaakov earns his place in the bris, in the covenant, in the destiny of the Jewish people over Esav because of who he is and because of who Esav is. And so because Yaakov has a deep sense of what it means to have a certain destiny, so prophetically, with divine inspiration, he sees that Ephraim has a special destiny. It's not that he's chosen over Menashe to the exclusion of Menashe. He says that Menashe will also be great. Menashe will also have a nachala amongst the Shvatim, but there's something superior about Ephraim. And so perhaps Yaakov is drawing on his own experience as someone who claimed his place in the bris, recognizing that individual people have individual destinies, that he can be sensitive to what's going on here. What's interesting, Rabbi Ben Nun takes a different perspective. I was reading his article on this Parsha, and what he argues, and it's really fascinating, is that Yaakov recognizes that Ephraim and Menashe are the only two children that are born outside the land of Canaan, and born outside of the home of Yaakov. And so when Yaakov says Banaihem, they're my children, what he's basically doing is he is switching them from being the children of Osnat bat Potifera Kohen On, right, the children of an Egyptian woman, and he's making them children of Rachel. That he's transferring Ephraim and Menashe to be children of Rachel, and as children of Rachel, they're in a different order. As children of Osnat bat Potifera Kohen On, Menashe is the oldest, Ephraim's the youngest. But Rabbi Ben Nun doesn't say this, but based on what he's saying, I would say, Yaakov is reinitiating them, rebirthing them, as it were, and as children of Rachel, Ephraim happens to be the Bechor for whatever reason. Ephraim's the Bechor, and then Menashe. So that's Rabbi Ben Nun, and I find it very interesting. But when it comes to this intuitive sense that divinely inspired that Yaakov has for the specialness of Ephraim, he's clearly drawing on his own experience of being chosen. And there's a fascinating comment of the Kli Yakar on this story, which amplifies this concept of chosenness, the fact that Yaakov feels it intimately, and the fact that he sees it within Ephraim and Menashe. And I have the Kli Yakar here in front of me. I didn't, I'm not putting it up on the screen for everyone to look at, because I don't want to get too bogged down in the text. But I'm just going to quote a little bit in the Hebrew, and of course I'll translate into English. But the Kli Yakar sees a value presented here. There's a philosophical concept here. Ki HaKadosh Baruch Hu bocher biyoser b'ktanim. Hashem chooses the smaller. Hashem is always choosing the smaller. What does that mean? It's a philosophical concept. He continues, V'chol adam sheish bo tzad katnus, az biyoser HaKadosh Baruch Hu magbiyo l'shisu la'alfei revava. That to whatever extent a person has a sense of katnus, of humility, the more Hashem elevates them. Remember, Yaakov says, Katonti mikol hachasodim, right? I am smaller. Abraham spoke to Hashem with a great sense of humility, even when he was arguing with him over Sodom. Whenever Hashem sees humility, lowliness within a person, a healthy lowliness, then Hashem will elevate that person, because that's a person who who knows how to submit themselves to a higher power, to the Kadosh Baruch Hu. And he quotes a couple psukim, a pasuk from Dvarim, a pasuk from Yeshaya. I'm not going to quote. V'karazeh l'chol zera Avraham, and this occurs to all of the progeny of Avraham. And watch what he does. Many have made this observation, but the Kli Yakar, I think, formulates it beautifully. Right? Ki Yishmael b'chor la'Avraham nifsal Yishmael v'nivchar Yitzchak. Right. So what happens first? Of the children of Avraham, the older one is cast aside, and the younger one is chosen. Yishmael, who is Avram's Bechor, is cast aside. He's not part of the bris. And Yitzchak is the one who's chosen. Yitzchak is the younger, the smaller, the more humble. Esav Bechor le Yitzchak. Esav, the next generation, was the firstborn to Yitzchak. Nifsal Esav v'nivchar Yaakov. Right? So Esav, the older one, is cast aside, and Yaakov is chosen. Reuven Bechor le Yaakov. Nifsal Reuven v'nivchar Yosef. Reuven is the Bechor of Yaakov. He is cast aside, as it were, in a different way, right? Reuven is not like Yishmael. Reuven is not like Esav, but he is not as chosen, as it were, as Yosef, v'nivchar Yosef. Menashe Bechor le Yosef, nivchar Ephraim be Yoser. Right? And Menashe is the Bechor, and Ephraim is the one who is chosen. So I find this idea from the Kli Yakar very compelling. It resonates with, again, it's an observation that many have made, that it's always the younger that's chosen over the older. And the Kli Yakar frames it in the context of the humility that Hashem desires, and the humility that Hashem wants to demonstrate. And so he demonstrates that by always choosing the younger over the older. If you think about that medrash, by the way, that we learn already in kindergarten, that Hashem chose Har Sinai, because Har Sinai was the shortest, was the smallest, was the most humble to give the Torah. That's another instance of this concept, of this principle. Moshe is chosen, as it were, over Aharon, who is older. What's interesting is Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch sees this idea and extends it back even further. And I'm sure if we were to talk it out, we would come to the same idea, because Cain is older than Hevel. And it was Hevel's gift to Hashem that was desired, that was chosen, and not Cain's. There is some discussion. There's some discussion about Shem, Cham, and Yefes. We don't know who the Bechor is, but there are some who suggest that Shem is not the Bechor, and the fact that Shem is the one who again is in line, eventually giving birth to Avraham, also represents this idea. But nevertheless, even from the very first children, you see that Hashem always prefers the younger to the older. And the way that Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch explains it is as follows. The Bechoros as a whole lost their status in the nation. Out of all this, one thing is clear. Whereas on the one hand, the firstborn remains the most favored, is the recognized representative of the family and has the responsibility of such, and accordingly receives Pishnaim, a double portion of the inheritance. Nevertheless, the goal is, as was announced to Rivka, Rav Yavod Sa'ir, the strong to be in service of the weak. But as an obstacle to this goal, spiritual power and national might are separated from each other. And so the way Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch presents this is that by choosing the younger, Hashem is demonstrating that it's not the mighty and it's not the powerful who are favored in Hashem's eyes, but rather those who strive, who work, who overcome, who want to come closer to Hashem. Those who are not necessarily born with a certain physical favoritism, but rather somebody who draws upon their own strength in order to advance themselves. That's sort of the idea that Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch is conveying here. But I think there's another layer to this above what the Kli Yakar and Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch are saying, because there's another story going on here aside from the younger always supplanting the older, and that is that there is always conflict between brothers. There's always a certain sense of competition. There's competition between Cain and Hevel. There's competition between Yishmael and Yitzchak. There's competition between Yaakov and Esav, and there's competition between Yosef and his brothers. And that's a motif that runs through the book of Bereshis. And if we put that story of competition alongside the story of the younger supplanting the older, what we find is something very beautiful. And that is that Yosef, as the latest instance of competition between brothers, is also the one who brings that competition to an end. Yosef is the one who puts a stop to that, cascading series of conflicts. Right? It climaxes, as it were, with Yosef being cast into the pit and being sold off to Egypt. And yet the fact that Yosef does not take vengeance, understands that there is a destiny and a purpose to everything that has happened, is the one who brings that story of conflict to an end. But I would say further. I would say that Ephraim and Manasseh are the ones who really bring it to an end, because Yosef and his brothers have to work things out. It's Ephraim and Manasseh who don't. Ephraim and Manasseh do not come into conflict. Ephraim and Manasseh are the ones who, for all we know, accepted their personal destinies. That Ephraim had something special to him, and Manasseh accepted his place, being supplanted as the Bechor. Moshe and Aaron do it as well, right? Aaron is gladly accepts the primacy of Moshe's position, of Moshe's leadership. Moshe and Aaron represent a new generation, a new stage in the history of the Jewish people, and brothers working together with each other. But the first generation to do it is not Yosef and his brothers. Yosef brings it to an end. It's Ephraim and Manasseh who are the ones who bring that story to a close. They have no conflict as far as we know. They are both. I think part of it is the fact that they're both introduced. They're both given something very special over and above their cousins, right? Both of them are treated much more special than their cousins. Ephraim and Manasseh both become tribes, whereas none of their first cousins do at all, right? They take a place amongst their uncles, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Ephraim, and Manasseh. And so I think that maybe that enables them, makes it easier on them to, especially on Manasseh, to not feel so supplanted, because he's given a very special destiny relative to his cousins, right? And so I speculate, this is a little bit homiletical, it's not pshat, but I speculate that Yesimcha Elokim K'Ephraim V'Chi Manasseh, that's the pinnacle, that's the ideal, that's what Sefer Bereshis was leading up to. As the Jewish people would go from becoming a family to a nation, Ephraim and Manasseh truly embody that sense of not just unity, because we talk about unity all the time, not just unity, but appreciating one's own unique destiny in the context of the klal, in the context of the broader nation. That both Ephraim and Manasseh can embrace their roles and get along and work together as the Jewish people become a nation. That's the paradigm. That's what we want every single Jewish person to know, boy and girl, right? And so we bless our sons, Yisimcha Elokim Ephraim and Menashe, because it's Ephraim and Menashe at the end of so many different generations of conflict and competition, who are able to embrace their roles personally in the context of a much bigger, broader destiny. So that's why I think maybe we bless our children like Ephraim and Menashe. But I want to go on a little bit further, and I see Ruth left us a comment, which I'm going to get to in a moment. But I just want to develop things a little bit further, because what's interesting, as I mentioned before, when Yaakov puts his hands on Ephraim and Menashe, when he switches them around, what he's essentially, what he does first, it seems, is he blesses Yosef, right? He turns to Yosef, and perhaps that makes sense because when you look at Pasuk Tesvav, right, verse 15, Vayvarech es Yosef Vayomar, right? He just switched his hands and put them on Ephraim and Menashe, and in verse 15, he doesn't bless Ephraim and Menashe, he blesses Yosef. Vayvarech es Yosef Vayomar Elokim asher hisalchu avosai lefanav, and so on and so forth. I think that makes sense. I think we can understand that better now that we understand what Ephraim and Menashe accomplish, because Ephraim and Menashe embody what Yosef accomplished. Yosef was able to bring reconciliation between him and his brothers, and what Yosef accomplishes is embodied in Ephraim and Menashe. The reconciliation, the sense of personal destiny, being part of a grander story. Yosef accomplishes that in real time by making up with his brothers, by not taking vengeance on them, by not settling any scores, by appreciating that it was all Hashem's plan. So Yosef does that actively. And then Ephraim and Menashe, by not competing, by embracing their roles, they embody what Yosef accomplished. So the fact that Yaakov would switch his arms, put them on Ephraim and Menashe, but then bless Yosef, I think reflects the fact that Ephraim and Menashe embody what Yosef accomplished. Let me just turn to Ruth's comment, and I'll just read it from the chat. Menashe, right, which means Hashem helped me to forget my pain, right? Ki noshani Elokim. Menashe is named for the fact that Hashem made me forget. Ephraim, ki hifrani, right? Hashem made me fruitful in exile. A healing for Yosef. The salvation is prominent with the naming of Ephraim, a more positive connotation. The meaning of the boy's name is significant. I see what you're saying here, Ruth, and that's correct, right? The naming of the sons, right? Menashe, I forget what we've been through, and Ephraim ki hifrani reflects that same trajectory. I think this is what you're saying, Ruth, reflects that same trajectory of rising above the past, right? Just like we said, that Yosef is able to reconcile, to bring that story to a close, and then advance a new stage in Jewish history of more cohesiveness. You're right, is reflected in the naming of the children from Menashe to Ephraim, and the fact that the goal is what Ephraim's name represents. Perhaps that's another reason why Ephraim is chosen over Menashe, because he represents that ideal that we're trying to reach. Thank you so much for that beautiful comment. The last thing I want to add to this discussion is a fascinating point from the Netziv, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, his commentary on Chumash Ha'emek Davar, because he notes something extraneous and builds a beautiful idea off of it, which I think will extend what we're saying. If you look in Pasuk Yud Daled, we were just looking at Tesvav 15. If you look at if you look at Pasuk Yudalid right before that, the end of the Pasuk says, Sikeles Yadav Ki Menashe HaBechor. Right? So he switched his hands because Menashe was the Bechor. The Netziv says that this is extra. We know Menashe is the Bechor. Why does the Torah have to remind us at this moment that Menashe is the Bechor, right? And not only, right, in the beginning of the Pasuk, it says Ephraim is the younger. So obviously by process of elimination, Menashe is the Bechor. Also, we already know that. We already know that from the Torah, but yet it seems that Sikeles Yadav Ki Menashe HaBechor, that there's something retained, as it were, with the fact that Menashe is the Bechor. Even though Ephraim is being designated now for special destiny, nevertheless, Menashe, it's not instead of Menashe. You know what it is? I just realized the Netziv doesn't say this, but I'm going to say this, and that is that Ephraim isn't being made the Bechor the way Yaakov earned the Bechorah. Right? Yaakov replaces Esav. But I don't think Ephraim is being made the Bechor instead of Menashe. Menashe is still the Bechor, and you'll see what the Netziv says. But Menashe is still the Bechor. Ephraim has special destiny, but Ephraim is not replacing Menashe. Let me read for you a little bit what the Netziv says here, because it's so fascinating. And he says that, he says, if you think about it, Yaakov did not necessarily need to switch his arms. He could have just switched the children, right? Why does he have to do something so strange by switching his arms? Why doesn't Yaakov just say, okay, Ephraim, you stand here, and Menashe, you stand here, or vice versa, right? I mean, this is my right hand, right? Ephraim, you stand here, and Menashe, you stand here. Why does he keep them in their same places and switch his arms? There's something significant to that, according to the Netziv. And he says, what he says basically is that he wants to keep Menashe at his right foot. Right? Menashe is at Yaakov's right foot, and Ephraim is at Menashe's left foot. And that's important. So Menashe is left hand, right foot, and Ephraim is right hand, left foot. This, by the way, this is how you play the hokey pokey, right? Yeah, that was a bad joke. Rabbis have an obligation. It's in our contract that we have to make jokes like that. Anyways, so what's the importance of this? So the Netziv says that Afal Gav Shehiktim Yaakov es Ephraim lifnei Menashe, even though Yaakov put Ephraim before Menashe, Umishum hachi haya bamidbar rosh hadegel, and for that reason, Ephraim is the head of his degel, of his flag in the desert, when the 12 tribes are arrayed around the Mishkan. So each set of 3 has a degel, has a head tribe. So Ephraim is the head tribe of his 3 Shvatim, not Menashe. Mikol makom, nevertheless, the Netziv, and he mentions this in Bamidbar as well, notices something very important, that in the census of the Jewish people at the end of Bamidbar, remember the Jewish people are counted at the beginning of Sefer Bamidbar and the end of Sefer Bamidbar, Menashe is listed first before Ephraim. What happened? Every other time going forward in the Torah, Ephraim is listed first because Ephraim has been supplanted, supposedly. Ephraim has been put first, right? He replaces Menashe, supposedly. But not at the end of Bamidbar. At the end of Bamidbar, Menashe is listed before Ephraim. And so what the Netziv develops, and he develops this idea in a number of places, is that Ephraim takes precedence in more spiritual matters. And Menashe takes precedence in more material or physical matters. And so the regel, the foot, right, that which moves us around and propels us through this world, that represents physical matters. And so that's why Menashe is kept at the right foot of Yaakov. Because in a material sense, Menashe is still the Bechor. But in more spiritual matters, represented by the hands, he places his right hand on Ephraim. because in more spiritual matters, Ephraim takes precedence. And so there's a real partnership here. Again, not a supplanting, not a replacement of Menashe with Ephraim, but rather there's an assignment of roles, of jobs. And this is the most brilliant part of what the Netziv says. He says, what's the difference between the census at the beginning of Bamidbar and the census at the end of Bamidbar? Well, the census at the beginning of Bamidbar was at Har Sinai, when the Jewish people were living a miraculous existence, a spiritual existence. They were being sustained by the bread of the heavens. So while they're still at Har Sinai, who goes first? Ephraim. Because Ephraim, in spiritual matters, takes precedence. But at the end of the 40 years in the desert, when they are counted in Arvos Moab, the Jewish people are now going to be living a more material existence in the land of Israel. No longer are they going to be eating mun. No longer are they going to be escorted by the clouds of glory. And so because the Jewish people are transitioning to a more material, this worldly existence, Menashe is listed first. It's very strange if you think about it. When the tribes are listed from the beginning to the Bamidbar to the end, Ephraim and Menashe are switched. How do you account for such a strange thing? Well, the Netziv accounts for it. He accounts for it because Menashe and Ephraim represent different things, different aspirations, different attributes. Right? So the whole notion of being Bechor is it comes with material benefits, right? The Bechor gets Pi Shnayim, right? The Bechor gets a double portion in the inheritance. That's a material benefit. Menashe still retains that status, the material element of being the Bechor. But Ephraim embodies, he represents something else, right? He represents something more spiritual, right? The Netziv writes, "V'nei hayad mishameshes es harosh v'hadas, v'haregel mishameshes halichus haguf lefitivo." Right, the hand ministers to the head and to the das, as it were, and so that represents more spiritual, more intellectual traits. V'haregel mishameshes halichus haguf lefitivo. It represents the foot represents the walkings. What drives a person according to his nature in this world, in material things. And so the Netziv concludes, Mishum hachi ratza Yaakov, asher Menashe yamod l'raglo yaminis, right? Yaakov wanted Menashe at his right foot to represent what's prominent about the foot. And he wanted Ephraim by his right hand to represent what is prominent about the hand. And Ruth, I was thinking the same thing that you just put in, right? It seems similar, it feels similar to that Yisachar Zevulun relationship that Chazal identify, that Zevulun supports Yisachar, who learns. It's a similar relationship. I think I agree with you. I agree with you very much. So, if that's the case, you know what I realized after learning this Netziv? Remember when I said that there's a connection between the giving of the brachos by Yaakov to Ephraim and Menashe and the giving of the brachos of Yitzchak to Yaakov and Esav? There's a similar material spiritual interplay, right? That to me, it seems Ephraim and Menashe achieve what Yitzchak thought he could achieve with Yaakov and Esav. If you look back at the blessings that Yitzchak gives to Yaakov and Esav, there are both material blessings and spiritual blessings, right? Those are material blessings. You'll get abundance, you'll have prominence, you'll have dominance. That's the bracha that Yitzchak thought he was giving to Esav and ended up giving to Yaakov, a material bracha. But when Yaakov is about to leave for Padan Aram, to flee from Esav, Yitzchak gives Yaakov a different bracha, knowing that it's Yaakov. And that's the bracha of Birkas Avraham. He gives him the blessing of Avraham, the spiritual destiny that Hashem has in store for the Jewish people. And so Yitzchak had intended, right? We want to know, why was Yitzchak giving the brachos to Esav? So my theory is that Yitzchak thought that Yaakov and Esav would have a partnership, and he would give material blessings to Esav, and he would give spiritual blessings to Yaakov. And that's in accordance with their nature, right? Esav was an Ish Tzayid, Ish Yodeh Tzayid, Ish Sadeh, and Yaakov is an Ish Tam Yoshev Ohalim. But Hashem had another plan, and Rivka knew that plan, and so that's why Rivka ensured that Yaakov got both brachos. But that's what Yitzchak thought he could do, this material spiritual partnership between Yaakov and Esav. But that did not happen. When does it happen? Ephraim and Menashe. That based on what the Netziv is saying, that Menashe represents a certain material blessing, and Ephraim represents a more spiritual blessing. Ephraim and Menashe achieve that sort of partnership and blessings that Yitzchak sought to accomplish. And so that's why B'cha Yivarech Yesimcha Elokim K'Ephraim V'Chi Menashe, right? That the brachos all along that Yitzchak wanted to give to Yaakov and Esav of both material and spiritual blessing, and how to balance that, that's the bracha we give to our children. That's the bracha that we give to our sons. Ephraim and Menashe represent a certain ideal in that relationship between the material and the spiritual. That's the idea that the Netziv inspired me to realize when it comes to these brachos of Ephraim and Menashe. All right. If anybody has any questions, please, I'll wait a moment. You can put it in the chat. You can chime in and unmute yourselves if you want. But thank you so much for joining, and have a great rest of the week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.